So, as stated by Dr. Canfield, we are the Power Seam Problems team, and that is myself, Alyssa Mercer, along with Catherine Colletti, Ashley Ann Davis, and Julien Denis. And we'll get rolling. All right, so first question, pretty obvious. What even are power seams? So, featured on this slide is a map that shows some of the major power pools in the United States. These tend to be covered by RTOs, regional transmission organizations, and the seams are everywhere you see where one of these power pools butts up against another power pool, or multiple power pools butt up against each other. Why are seams a problem? Well, the seam is going to be the area furthest from like the central hubs of a given RTO. And that means that those seams have less infrastructure, but they also tend to run into issues with infrastructure overlapping when two power pools do not communicate well enough with each other. So that's sort of some of the issue that we can see in there. And then just as a further definition of pools, so pools are groupings of utilities that can operate as independent utilities, loose pools, brokered pools, or tight pools. And that depends on the degree of centralization. And we're not going to get too much into the weeds on that here for this presentation. But now Ashley is going to cover the problems that we can run into in these power seams.
So like Alyssa mentioned, the seams are kind of at the intersection and far away from the hub. So at the intersection of two different transmission markets. So because they're in this weird spot, the things that operate within the seams can deal with a plethora of problems. So with it being between two transmission markets, you can have different operating rules, different transmission access scheduling, and different pricing models. So each different market entity can have its own set of operating rules. So the people or the businesses existing within these seams can see, differences in operating rules in the sense that, for a portion of the electricity they're receiving, it could have X rules, and for the other portion, it could have Y rules, which obviously can create some confusion or some problems if those rules are very different, or if one particular rule is very different, can cause a lot of challenges. And a major issue is the difference in pricing models. So this can lead to something that's known as rate pancaking. And rate pancaking happens when you have two different pricing models and the people within the seams have to pay the two different rates. And usually sometimes if you're getting the majority of your electricity from the cheaper seam, this could, it could be beneficial to you, but for the most part, what happens is that you end up paying more than you really should have if you were in one of the two power pools. So it just kind of depends, but usually it has a negative connotation. This also can lead to increased transmission prices because you're in between two different power pools. It's kind of like competing. And then you could also have inconsistent transmission, so middle times and tariff services. So this also kind of ties into the rate pancaking, is that you could be paying more for taxes on one area than the next. And then of course, as you can see in this diagram, you can have impeded market liquidity. So I kind of think of this diagram kind of like the osmosis diagram, with particles moving from one side to the other. But what can happen is that you can create congestion if there's an overflow of electricity between the two seams, and this just reduces the liquidity. And then, of course, with all of these combined, you're dealing with the reliability issues in the sense that, for example, the MISO could be down today, or SPP could have issues tomorrow, so you're never really sure what's going to happen when you're in the seam. And I'm going to pass it along to Catherine to talk about the solutions.
Awesome. So since these problems occur because you have that mismatch in market structures between these different pools or different market structures, like the big picture wise, you solve that by not having a difference. But our system does have differences because you're allowed to have different types of market structures and different allowances and practices, and you just have different cultures between all of those different groups. So I'm going to take a look at a couple of solutions that have been proposed by different groups. And the first of those is suggestions by the Missouri Public Service Commission. So since Missouri sits where we have two different regional transmission organizations, the SPP and then MISO, along with a very large co-op, AECI, we have a lot of seams in Missouri. So this is a special concern for Missouri. So one of the suggestions put out by the Public Service Commission was to renegotiate the joint operating agreements between the RTOs more often, specifically between MISO and SPP, just because this will allow for, as changes occur in these RTOs, like large acquisitions or other scenarios, we're able to more adequately address issues that come up. So for example, between 2008 and 2014, over that 6 years, there were no interregional transmission projects that were done between the Southwest Power Pool and MISO. And that was kind of as a result of the fact that one, it was really hard to allocate costs for those projects, and they just weren't considered by those two bodies together. And that kind of leads into the second suggestion from the Missouri Public Service Commission, and that would be to create a more comprehensive cost allocation structure. Because for a lot of these projects, a project for one part of the grid, even if it might most benefit those people right around that grid, it'll impact the entire rest of the region because of how it impacts the congestion, kind of like what Ashley Ann was talking about. So they really suggest having a cost allocation structure that will fairly assess the cost of the project to all those that would benefit from it. So that way you don't kind of have a free rider problem, and you're really able to get the funding for these projects. An example of that they referenced was the KETA project, which was a transmission route that went from Spearville, Kansas to Axtell, Nebraska. And that project did occur within one RTO. So that was within the Southwest Power Pool. But that was kind of an example of even within one region, weighing all the different regional considerations and slight differences in cost structure to create one cost structure that would then benefit that entire region. So there were benefits congestion-wise felt as far down as Texas because of that change. And so they were really able to get a good cost allocation for that project. And we can go ahead and move on to the next example. Okay, and then another one of the proposed solutions was one that came out of a study that the Southwest Power Pool put on. And the key findings from that study were that overall between these different RTOs and market structures, there needed to be better communication and more regular communication. So that way, when these groups are doing their planning for the next year, they're able to have a better idea of what the other groups are planning, which might impact how they plan capacity. And since these seams problems are primarily due to inefficiencies, having better data so you can plan based on the other groups allows them to become more interdependent and to overall deliver lower rates to consumers. Along with that, it's recommended that there be clearer metrics on how seams projects are addressed. These seams projects are typically infrastructure or other initiatives to kind of bridge these gaps. But just having clearer metrics that are known to both of the entities involved allows for more success in proposing seams projects. With that, they also recommend more innovative payment mechanisms. And this kind of goes back to the Missouri Public Service Commission recommendations to have a structure that would fairly allocate cost. Now that fair allocation, again, is subject to a lot of consternation in figuring out what that means. But having some mechanism where there would be perhaps a share in ownership or scheduling rights based on investment in that. And then They also recommend just clear guidelines on how to even solve these problems, because some of this probably sounds a little bit vague just because these problems can be present in so many different scenarios. They exist a little bit differently depending on the seams involved and the projects being proposed, but having some kind of common process for resolving these issues would still be a step in the right direction to even be able to solve them as they come up. And with that, I'll go ahead and pass it off to Julien.
All right, so firstly, out of all the team's extensive research, we found that a lot more data gathering and analysis needed to be done for like really better transparency of what happens in the seams for consumers and what the RTOs face day to day. But what we do recommend is an upgraded software for RTOs to maintain and dictate power generation and distribution in those seams. So if there was more access to the data, a plan for how the RTOs need to distribute and plan in the seams could help with the outages and lower costs for consumers. So improved software would help balance and when and which RTO is supplying power into those seams. This plan/software would require the commitment of multiple RTOs with constant communication between them, just like we stated in the previous slide. This recommendation is only more of a short term and is more of a patch than a solution. The constant communication could also lead to like human errors. So all that data gathering would really need a strong, well laid out plan for RTOs to really put a better product out, a better power distribution out. A more permanent long-term solution would be a very, very large investment into infrastructure between the seams. This is more unlikely due to RTO debates and the return on the investment yields. Far too often, RTOs can't come to an agreement, which stalls the process. And we kind of hit on that with the problems. But with all that being said, I'll open it up to questions.